welcome to this explainer. Imagine, just for a second, a scenario where a private business gets so incredibly powerful, I mean literally so vast, that the government back home suddenly realizes, uh-oh, we're completely losing control. Think about the absolute biggest modern megacorporations we know today, right? Now picture them armed to the teeth and actually governing entire nations. Crazy, right? Well, today we're looking at exactly that. We're driving into the British Parliament's desperate, sweeping attempt to rein in a massive, totally unruly megacorporation, the East India Company. So this brings up the defining puzzle of this whole era. How exactly does a government, sitting comfortably in London, even attempt to regulate a private, profit-driven corporation that has somehow found itself ruling over an entire subcontinent thousands of miles away? It's like a giant puzzle. We're going to explore the trial, the error, and those absolutely vital legal course corrections Parliament used to try and finally tame them.
Okay, let's jump straight into Section 1, Rule by the East India Company. To really understand the sheer scale of the problem here, we need to look at the staggering corporate power dynamics right before the year 1773. You see, the East India Company wasn't just trading spices and textiles anymore. Not even close. They were extensively ruling massive, deeply populated territories, specifically the presidencies of Bombay, Bengal, and Madras. This was literally a private company with the footprint of an empire, managed by a governor and council who answered only to a court of directors sitting all the way back in England.
But here's the catch. Before 1773, there was absolute administrative chaos on the ground. Why? Because there was simply no central dominant authority over these massive regions in India. You basically had different presidencies operating entirely in their own bubbles. It was fragmented, deeply inefficient, and honestly a highly vulnerable way to run such vast territories. Parliament looked at this and realized, something had to change, and it had to change fast.
Which brings us to Section 2, the 1773 Regulating Act.
Realizing the sheer scale of this mess, Parliament stepped in with a historic solution, and this landmark act was a total game changer. For the very first time, the British government officially recognized the political and administrative functions of the company. They weren't just merchants anymore, right? They were rulers. So to fix that lack of central authority we just talked about, the act created a brand new centralized powerhouse title, the Governor-General of Bengal. Lord Warren Hastings was the famously appointed first man to hold this role, and he was advised by a four-member executive council. And crucially, this act made the previously independent governors of Bombay and Madras directly subordinate to him. Finally, a clear hierarchy was established.
And the speed of this centralization, it was incredibly rapid. We moved from the pre-1773 era, which, remember, was defined by that fractured corporate structure, straight into the sweeping legal hammer of the 1773 Regulating Act. By 1774, this whole process culminated in the creation of a Supreme Court at Calcutta. It featured a Chief Justice and 3 judges, with Sir Elijah MP appointed as the very first Chief Justice. Law and order, British style, was officially touching down.
Now, this brilliantly illustrates what the British government was truly deeply worried about behind closed doors: widespread, unchecked corporate corruption. The 1773 Act tackled this head-on with some very strict prohibitions. Servants of the East India Company were now legally banned from engaging in any private trade on the side. No side hustles. They were entirely prohibited from accepting presents and explicitly banned from taking bribes from the native populations. Parliament was trying to clean house and ensure the wealth actually flowed back to the state, not just into the deep pockets of rogue company employees. To enforce all of this, Parliament essentially demanded the receipts. They forced an unprecedented level of transparency by tightening their grip on the company. The act legally required the company's court of directors to formally report back to the British government on all revenue, civil, and military affairs happening in India. The days of operating in the dark were effectively over. Parliament wanted eyes on absolutely everything. Moving right along to Section 3, the 1781 Act of Settlement. So, whenever you introduce sweeping new laws, you inevitably hit some major roadblocks, right? Well, the 1773 Act essentially created 2 massive power centers: the newly minted Supreme Court and the executive power of the Governor-General. And almost immediately, this created a massive jurisdictional clash. You had the highest judges and the highest executive officials constantly stepping on each other's toes, fiercely fighting over who actually had the ultimate say in governing the territory. The 1781 Act was specifically designed to untangle this exact mess. To solve this bitter clash, the 1781 Act of Settlement came down hard in favor of the executive branch. It completely exempted the Governor General and his Executive Council from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court for their official actions. And it didn't stop there. It also extended this exemption to the servants of the company. Furthermore, and this is absolutely crucial, all revenue matters were entirely excluded from the Supreme Court's jurisdiction. The message here was loud and clear. The courts could not interfere with the actual business of running the government and, of course, collecting the money.
This built an entirely new legal hierarchy. The 1781 Act completely restructured how justice flowed. Now, initial cases were heard at the provincial courts, but when it came to the appeals process, those appeals bypassed the Supreme Court entirely. Instead, they went straight to the Governor General and Council. This empowered the executive branch even further, giving them the authority to frame regulations without constant Supreme Court oversight breathing down their necks.
Now, what's really fascinating is how the British attempted to manage the local population within Calcutta itself. The 1781 Act instructed the Supreme Court to exercise jurisdiction over all people in Calcutta, but with one major caveat. They had to administer personal laws strictly based on religion. That meant Hindus would be tried according to Hindu laws and Muslims would be tried according to Mohammedan laws. It was a very deliberate attempt to codify and rule through existing traditional legal frameworks, rather than just imposing a blanket British legal code on the personal lives of the native residents. Looking back at the historical arc taking shape here, we can see a massive, massive shift. These two pivotal pieces of legislation, the 1773 Regulating Act and the 1781 Act of Settlement, they moved India away from a system of pure, unchecked corporate rule. Together, they legally laid down the very foundation for what would eventually become a fully centralized British administration. Which leaves us with a truly fascinating final thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. The British Parliament undoubtedly laid the foundation for central controls starting in 1773 to curb corporate chaos and greed. But look at the incredible administrative, legal, and executive powers they had to invent just to do it. So, did this grand experiment in corporate regulation actually fix the corruption of a rogue company? Or did Parliament just accidentally assemble a perfect legal machinery for an entire British Empire? Think about that, and I'll see you in the next explainer.